Hi, I would like to say a few more words about the myth of Prometheus as a sort of follow-up to our discussion yesterday evening, and also a little bit about the idea of myth in general, and in some ways in the spirit of critical thinking to bring a critical approach to myth, not assume that we already know what myth is. I think often, and what I hope to show is something of a naive perspective. We often assume that myth is almost like a fairy tale, or a story that is just kind of dreamt up by somebody's imagination, or fantastical. And I hope to show for example, mythos, a myth. It's in fact directly contrasted to logos. So the idea would be like myth would be antithetical to reason or to critical thinking, and again, I think this is there's something to a statement like that, but I also think it's very one-sided and even naive. So I hope that something of the picture that I try to present today will at least show why this might be the case. That in fact, mythos and logos they belong together in some way. And so I hope to use the myth of Prometheus because it's familiar to us from prior discussions and from reading Plato's Protagoras and also from the presentation that Xavier gave on it yesterday. I'd like to use just this short myth to try to illustrate these general tenets of mythology. So just to think about myth in the first place, the majority of the myths that we have, traditional ones, extend back to a time before the invention of writing. Certainly before Google, obviously, but before writing itself. So we should imagine oral cultures and people would, if we can just put ourselves in this scene, imagine in the community, people gathering around after the day's work to hear the bard, the poet, speak about these epic tales of strife and love and cosmological adversity and contests. And the bard, though, it's not as though the bard is it's not as though you know. Today, if somebody spoke in that way, you would assume that this person, researched the question, read about it, or something like that, right? But this is a totally different context. If we were people back then, we would see the bard as somehow channeling almost a divine speech. And in fact, Homer, for example, starts both of his famous epics by doing exactly that, by invoking the power of the muse. He would say, "Sing in me, muse. Sing in me, muse of the wrath of Achilles, the son of Peleus." He's sort of making himself receptive to this poetical or epic inspiration, and it's just amazing to picture a scene like that and how much it contrasts to just everything that we take for granted today. We can think about the myths too as giving the people a way to sort of not exactly see behind appearances so much. That's one way to put it, but it's also to try to give underpinnings to what they see, to the phenomena that they are encountering in everyday life, right? To give something a sort of context and a background. There's obvious myth about or obvious, I should say, it's relatively well known about how the spring comes back when Pluto releases Persephone, whom he abducted, and she is some way the herald, a goddess of spring, and when she comes back, then the flowers begin to bloom again because Demeter is happy. Demeter's her mother. This, for example, I mentioned this as an example of how the myth gives some kind of resonance or context to something like the return of spring after the season of the barren season of winter. And then the Prometheus myth offers something very analogous in terms of giving a sort of cosmological context to understanding of something. And the reason that I bring that up, in some way it might seem obvious, but I want to add something to it, which is, in many ways, that's what we receive from science today. And then I might be accused of comparing things that are categorically different between myth and science, like as though they might be the opposites in some way, but I think they're not as different as they might seem. And the reason that I say that is because, so in every myth, there's no myth that just comes out of nowhere. I mentioned Persephone. Well, she has a mother, Demeter. She has somebody who abducts her, Pluto. Each one of these has a family and relations, right? And so I guess the picture that I'm trying to give is that the mythology of any given culture, it presents a coherent network of all different relations. The myth that I'll briefly recount of Prometheus, it's very similar. Prometheus' father, Aeptus, and he has offspring. He has a brother, Epimetheus, who's another protagonist in this story. It's not at all unlike the way that scientific theories have to be. They have to be able to harmonize with one another. We can't have theories of science that are antagonistic, in the same way that we can't have myths that contradict themselves. In fact, there's a contemporary example of something that physicists look at as a problem. It's specifically reconciling or harmonizing Einstein's theory of general relativity with the theory of quantum mechanics, and those two theories present different pictures of the way the world works, and they're at odds with one another. And so physicists feel sort of imperative to work to attempt to find a way to reconcile those two theories. It's not at all unlike the way that we receive often sort of conflicting testimonies of the parentage of certain gods, for example, or many myths have several different versions. And in fact, as a rule, one story will have several different versions or modifications, but kind of two original bards in the Greek tradition are Homer and Hesiod, and often they give slightly different accounts of the gods, and so the reason that I mention that, though, is because we notice those accounts because they're exceptions to the rule. In other words, we notice the inconsistencies because most of it presents a coherent picture of in the case of mythology, they're thought of as beings, like agents behind. I'm contrasting that to kind of physical laws, which we don't think of as any kind of consciousness or agency behind them. And so just to put ourselves kind of to again try to approach the myth, not assuming that we already really kind of, well, sort of to approach the myth with mythology itself with fresh eyes. This can sort of create a fertile conditions in our minds to see new sides of something or new dimensions even of something that we might maybe thought we knew about before. And so I will just briefly summarize the myth of Prometheus, and then I would like to just introduce a few themes that it brings up, and rather than explain them, I would like to just put them forth more as invitations for us to think about together over the next week or several weeks. The myth of Prometheus is basically, in a way, it's a sort of creation myth in the sense that these two brothers, Prometheus and Epimetheus, are tasked with endowing the creatures of the earth, including human beings. They're tasked by Zeus, who is the recent victor of what's called it's the kind of struggle of the gods. It's the victory of the Olympian gods, this generation of gods of whom Zeus is the regent. They recently overcame this generation above them, the Titans, of which Kronos, or Saturn in the Roman, the Latin is the name is Saturn, and in Latin Kronos in Greek. Similarly, Zeus is the Greek name for the one the Romans more or less equivalency called Jupiter. And so our planets obviously are named after the Roman, are given the Roman names of these gods, but they're almost more or less equivalency between the Greek and the Roman pantheon. But so newly victorious Zeus and the Olympians had tasked these two brothers with endowing the creatures of the earth with gifts or endowments, characteristics, and the brothers sort of Zeus delegated his work to the brothers, and they between the two of them they divided the work amongst themselves. Prometheus was in charge of basically finishing or putting the finishing touches on perfecting the human being amongst the creatures of the earth. Epimetheus was in charge of the rest of them. He was given the bag of endowments that Zeus kind of gave them all at once in a sack or something to Epimetheus, to the two brothers, and Epimetheus took the sack. And so he was going to one by one dole out these gifts to the different creatures. Prometheus was going to inspect once Prometheus had done it, sort of checking his work, so to speak. In the meantime, Prometheus was busy perfecting the human being. And so Prometheus proceeded around as according to plan, sort of doling out the gifts, giving claws to the tiger and wings to the eagle and horns to the bull, sting to the scorpion, etc. And he was going around giving gifts, and he was so enthusiastic with giving out the gifts that by the time he came back, returned to Prometheus, who had been working on the human being this whole time, sculpting the human form out of mud, he had completely run out of gifts. His sack was empty. And so when Prometheus asked for something that he could give, some kind of endowment for the human being, to a characteristic attribute or trait or power to the human being, the bag was empty. Right? And there's kind of a sort of, their names, the names of these two brothers are in some way meant to express this. They're meant to express the same. The myth itself is kind of reflected in their names. Prometheus, the name is often translated as forethought, and Epimetheus' name is often translated as afterthought. In some way, those are superficial or even naive translations, just because the words in English they fail to carry the same comprehensive resonances as the ones in Greek. We can really think of, metis or metheus, it's a kind of cleverness, practical cleverness is probably a good translation. And so that's the root of both of the words, metheus. And within the prefixes, they give different pictures. Pro, which is often translated as for or before, forethought. We could really think of it something something that is, it can also mean with or towards. So something that's kind of together with or towards the center. Pro. Epi, by contrast, it gives kind of the inverse picture. So epi means either before or after or outside of or around or on top of. Right? And so we get these two contrasting pictures of something that is together with, or something that is around or outside of, is maybe a better way to look at it. And so Prometheus, the name, the etymology of the name means something like with cleverness or together with cleverness, towards cleverness, to cleverness. Prometheus means kind of the opposite. It's like outside of, around, peripheral to cleverness. But so, and then the myth itself, those names are representative of the story itself. Now, Prometheus he feels kind of responsible to give some kind of endowment to the human being because he can't tolerate the idea that, because this human being would just perish on the earth without any sort of endowments like the rest of the animals. No claws, no scales, no horns. And so Prometheus resolves to steal fire from the gods. And this is what he does, and he pays the price for it. But he is the one who brings fire, the gift of fire, to the human beings. So they don't have anything else, but they have the use of fire to themselves. Of all the creatures of the earth, the only one that has fire is the human being. I'm going to pause the video now, divide it into two parts, and so I'll return shortly.